Welcome back. We just heard from Brad Schimel, the race to April 1st in the Wisconsin Supreme Court election. Now let's bring in Dane County Circuit Court Judge Susan Crawford. Judge, good to see you. Welcome to the show. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I want to start with the last Supreme Court race that we had in Wisconsin. 2 years ago, many people said that race, specifically Justice Protasiewicz, really opened the door to how political these races have become. Are you embracing that during your campaign?
Well, look, I think
or are you pushing it a little further?
I think it's important for voters to know who the candidates are. So I have spent a lot of time talking about my record, my background as a prosecutor, as a lawyer representing people in court and standing up for their rights, and now as a judge. And I think it's important for voters to know the work I've done and something about my values. And I think there's appropriate ways for judicial candidates to talk about those things. So that's what I plan to do.
We'll walk through some of these high-profile cases that are before the court or could be before the court. Justice Hagedorn recently recused himself from the lawsuit involving Act 10. Republicans are also asking Justice Protasiewicz to do the same. Do you think she should recuse herself from that case?
You know, I guess what I would say is that I expect Justice Protasiewicz to do exactly what the law requires in this situation, which is to closely look at the facts and the parties in the case and the legal issue that is being raised, and to apply the law as found in the Judicial Code, and to make her own determination about whether she believes she can be fair and impartial in that case. That's what I do when I'm asked to recuse from a case, or if I spot an issue in a case that I think might warrant some consideration of recusal. You know, I look at what the facts are and make a determination based on the law. And that's what I think she should do. And it's not my position or anybody else's to tell her how to reach that conclusion.
Would you recuse yourself from any cases involving Act 10?
I would engage in the analysis that I just mentioned. I think it's really important to do that on a case-by-case basis. And again, just to maintain impartiality, I would have to not make that decision until I had conducted that full analysis. So I'm not going to announce in advance how I would decide such issues. That's part of the decision-making process in a case.
Even though your firm, you used to work for represented teachers in a lawsuit looking to overturn it.
That's true, and that's work I'm proud of. I represented public school teachers in a legal challenge to Act 10. I was in court fighting for their rights in the workplace after the government took them away. Act 10, you know, the public, I think, kind of tends to think of it as like one uniform thing. It was a 50-page long bill that changed many different provisions of the Wisconsin statutes. So if there were another case presented to me involving some part of Act 10, I would look at which part is being challenged there, who are the parties bringing that action, and is that a case that I can be fair and impartial on, a case where I have not previously taken a position on the specific issue being raised.
Would you back any efforts to impose recusal rules for the court?
Well, we do have a judicial code in Wisconsin that does set standards for recusal and conflicts of interest and similar topics for judges. And I think it's a workable system. But I also welcome any opportunities to strengthen and improve a system like that.
As you know, there's a ton of money being pumped into this campaign, and there will be over the next 7 weeks. Republicans recently have been criticizing you for attending a recent briefing with Democratic donors. The subject of that invitation was chance to put 2 more House seats in play for 2026. Now that all of this is public, would you attend that same briefing again with donors?
Yeah, you know, for that particular group, there was a Zoom meeting. I entered that meeting, introduced myself, told the group a bit about the race. I did not comment on anything related to the congressional maps. That's not a topic I have commented on either publicly or privately in any sense. And then I left the meeting. And groups like that, organizations like that, have the issues that they care about, that they want to talk about amongst themselves. They have a First Amendment right to have those kinds of discussions on the issues they care about. It's not up to me to set their agenda.
Did you know that was the subject or the premise of the meeting before you entered it?
I don't believe I did. I hadn't seen the email, and I wasn't part of the meeting at which they discussed that issue at all.
Republicans say that you're attempting to sell congressional seats to raise funds from Democratic billionaires.
It's ridiculous. It is an absolutely ridiculous assertion. And I told that group what I tell every group that I appear in front of, which is that I am pledging to be a fair and impartial justice.
Planned Parenthood Advocates of Wisconsin has endorsed your campaign.
Yes.
And the endorsement. They said that you've, quote, protected access to reproductive health care. Did you commit to them, or do you commit to them that you will do that as a justice?
Yeah, no, I did not. And I would never make any kind of promise to any organization like that to, deliver some kind of result. At the same time, I am, I'm proud of the work that I did as a lawyer in our courts, fighting for people's rights, including Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin and their doctors to protect their right to deliver health care services to women without having to be in fear of felony prosecution for doing it.
You represented Planned Parenthood.
I did.
Do you think that you should recuse yourself from any case involving abortion?
I do not. I think that it is important in any case that comes before the court to make those determinations about whether I can be fair and impartial based on what the particular facts are, what the particular legal challenge might be in a case like that, and to make a decision based on whether I can be impartial in that particular case. The law does not require judges to automatically recuse just because they have done some kind of legal work in the past as a lawyer. But I am committed to only hearing cases and only sitting on cases where I believe I can be fair and impartial.
The state's voter ID law will also be before voters on the April 1st ballot. I'm curious, will you vote to enshrine the state's law into the Constitution?
I am not going to say how I personally would vote because I don't want to influence other voters. I really think it's important that voters be able to make their own choices. And I'm a judge. I'm really not a politician. And it's not my place to tell voters how to vote on something like that. I think that voters should consider the fact that, we need to have safe and secure elections, and we need a system where all qualified voters can exercise their right to cast a ballot and to make their own decisions about whether that provision should pass or not.
If it failed and if a case came before the state Supreme Court challenging the law, would you feel comfortable hearing that case, given previous comments you've made about the state's voter ID law?
It really depends.
Yeah.
And that's another question where I would have to look at what the facts are, what the legal arguments are being presented by the parties. Who are the parties bringing that case in front of the Wisconsin Supreme Court? And only make a decision at that point about whether I could be fair and impartial.
So, what type of impact do you think President Trump and the first 100 days of his administration will have on this race, April 1st?
I'm not a politician, so that's a little bit above my pay grade to make those kinds of guesses. I'm not a pundit. I don't predict these kinds of things. I think that some of his decisions are spawning a lot of litigation. Those will be in the federal courts for the most part. And people should be watching what's happening, paying attention. I think that's important always for people to be engaged in the political process, both what's happening at the national level and the state level.
7 weeks to go. Dane County Judge Susan Crawford. Judge, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Up next, show me the money.